Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
New York is a place that Donald Trump may have to spend a whole lot less of time because the trial is about to wrap up. We still have 1 week to go, Joe, although he's not going to have to be in court every day for the rest of this week. Closing arguments on Tuesday as his defense, together with the prosecution, which of course was pleading the case on the behalf of District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who's charged him with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to this hush money payments. Both the prosecution and defense are done trying to make the arguments. They're not testifying any witnesses. They'll have their final word next Tuesday.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to see how quickly we ran through this. I thought he was going to start warming up to New York again. I thought staying the night at Trump Tower, it might be something reinvigorating Fifth Avenue, but I think maybe that's not going to happen. He's back to Mar-a-Lago as soon as physically possible. And next week, it's going to be something. You were there when jury selection began. Imagine the security that will come with the actual verdict being delivered. We're in for some pretty heady stuff next week. So it's a good opportunity for us to see where we stand now and look at both arguments here, both cases. Dave Aronberg joins us, Palm Beach County State's attorney, with his take on this. He's been walking us through the arguments since opening statements. Dave, it's great to see you. I wonder your thoughts on the way the defense brought this to a close, largely yesterday with a man named Robert Costello, a lawyer on the stand, who misbehaved so much during his testimony. The judge had to clear the courtroom twice and threatened to strike his entire testimony from the record. Is that the best way to leave a final impression with the jury?
No. Joe and Kailey, good to be with you. You know, I wonder why they called Robert Costello to the stand, because it was going pretty well for Todd Blanche, Trump's lawyer. Todd Blanche scored some impressive punches against Michael Cohen, and then they decided to call their only substantive witness, Robert Costello. Now, I think the reason why they called him is because Costello has been a darling on the far right. And if you watch far right media, they've been urging Trump's legal team to call Costello, because Costello, who tried to be Michael Cohen's lawyer, apparently knew that Cohen was lying and was going to expose him as a liar and a fraud, someone who said that Donald Trump was innocent all along. And the defense called him. I think it was because Donald Trump, who watches those programs, probably urged his legal team, call him, and they did, and it blew up in their face. What a debacle. They wanted Robert Costello. They got Abbott and Costello. It was a joke. They got a guy who was insulting the judge. Haley's too young to remember Abbott and Costello, Joe. We're the old guys.
God, so are we. What are you talking about?
You got a guy who was insulting the judge, who had to clear the courtroom. And then today he was under cross-examination, and there were text messages between Costello and his law partner that pretty much said that Cohen's an a-hole and that this guy Cohen, we gotta, help the boss. He needs to play ball, essentially. And that's so devastating.
Okay, so we obviously heard some testimony from Robert Costello. Who we did not hear from, though, Dave, is Donald Trump himself. Despite teasing on more than one occasion that he might indeed testify in his own defense, he very clearly did not take the stand before the defense rested today. If ultimately a lot of this is going to come down to the word of Michael Cohen, who, of course, the defense tried to paint as an uncredible witness, considering he's perjured himself before, versus the word of Donald Trump, and we didn't hear from Donald Trump, what does his lack of testimony, if not not surprising, do to the case overall?
It was smart that Trump did not take the stand, because if he did, he would be walking into a perjury trap. If he did, he'd be confronted with really embarrassing details about his affair with Stormy Daniels and others. I mean, the E. Jean Carroll case would have been thrown in his face, really bad stuff. And so he listened to his lawyers, and he did not take the stand. He was never going to take the stand in this case. But they don't have to. The prosecution has the entire burden. And so the defense didn't even really put on a case. They're just trying to poke holes in the prosecution's case. And they made some headway in poking holes in Michael Cohen's testimony. But in the end, the prosecution built up Michael Cohen with a lot of corroborating evidence, not just testimony from other witnesses, which were important, but also Trump's own words in his tweets, in his court documents. Documents are much more powerful than any testimony because people can lie, but documents rarely do. And I think that's why this case is headed towards a guilty verdict, because you may not want to like Michael Cohen. You may not believe that he's always telling the truth. But when the prosecution shows you corroboration, it means that, yeah, he's telling the truth now.
That's really interesting. Dave Aronberg says it will be a guilty verdict. That said, in that world, is this a jury that will have to chew on this for a long time? What will deliberations look like, Dave?
Wow, the only thing that's predictable about juries is that they are notoriously unpredictable. So what's going to happen behind that closed door? I bet you'll be talking about how the defense's only witness was chewed out by the judge. And although, yes, I know the jury wasn't there when Judge Merchan laid into Costello, they felt the vibe in the room. They saw how Costello was muttering under his breath and giving the judge a side eye. And you know that stuff is going to make it in the deliberation room, which will discredit the entire defense strategy, I think. And I think in the end, yeah, it's going to lead towards a guilty verdict. Now, could it be a hung jury? Sure. But I do not believe there's really any chance that this will be an acquittal. So there could be a compromise verdict. Perhaps they convict on some counts and not all. And perhaps they have a hung jury on some or all. But Donald Trump's not walking totally free out of this, not based on what I saw for the past few weeks.
Well, we won't know for at least a week longer, Dave, because as Joe and I have mentioned, closing arguments aren't until next Tuesday. Just how unusual is it to have a week-long break like this between when they actually rest their cases and when the jury gets to take up the case?
It is a bit unusual, but you're running up against the holiday calendar and days where the court takes off anyways. And so, Memorial Day. So what they didn't want was to have closing arguments and then to send the jury home for the long Memorial Day weekend. And then you start deliberating on Monday. You don't want the jury to talk about it with their families, with their friends. You want all the conversation to be done in the deliberation room, and you want it right after the closing argument. So it was the right move for the judge to postpone the closings until next week. And look, it gives commentators like me more of a chance to go on Bloomberg to discuss it.
Right.
Well, God knows you're not going to be done after this one, Dave. I've got news for you. Can I just clarify, by the way, and I'll apologize in advance to my partner, Kailey, on this. Is there a rule against side eye? The judge Merchan is calling out Costello for giving him side eye. How does that work, Dave Aronberg?
It wasn't just side eye. It was that Costello was on the stand, and Costello comes from that right-wing ecosphere or ecosphere, whatever you want to call it, where they hate Judge Merchan. They think he's corrupt and compromised. And so he took the stand, and you can see his disgust on the stand. And when Judge Merchan was sustaining the prosecution's objections, you had Costello from the witness stand saying things like, geez, and even saying struck, like he's the judge to strike things from the record. And the judge was like, excuse me? And you had Costello giving him a side eye. So it was all of those things. And then after the jury was out of the room, when the judge was dressing down Costello, the judge said, are you staring me down? Is that what you're doing? And so it just kept getting worse from there. Really bad shape. And that's why these judges wear the robes and have the big gavel, and you have to stand up when they enter the room because they're in control of the courtroom.
Mm-hmm.
Just more evidence of how different this all might feel if we actually saw these things playing out on camera
someday
in real time. Dave Aronberg, it's always great to see you on camera and hear your voice. For
Thank you, Dave.
Those who are listening on Bloomberg Radio, Dave Aronberg, of course, is the state attorney for Palm Beach County. Never a shortage of color in these cases, Joe, but it is worth keeping in mind for the vast majority of Americans, including us, we've only read about what has happened in that room. We did not get to see or hear it for ourselves.
That's why I think we need more dramatic readings of what's happening in the court. I think there's a whole industry there.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We're tracking where the money's going in terms of the presidential race because, Joe, in the month of April, more money went to Donald Trump and the RNC than Joe Biden and the DNC. This is a change in the pattern we have seen up until this point in this election cycle. Joe Biden pulls in $51 million. Donald Trump, $76 million, and that's them and the parties combined.
This is important because it's the first time it's happened in this campaign cycle. And I know that everyone's going to say, but Joe, cash on hand, Joe Biden still has an enormous advantage when it comes to money. And that's true. They've been outraising on a campaign level and on a party level almost 2-1 for the better part of this cycle. But to see this, whether it's an outlier or a turning point, is the question. And that's what we want to get into with our panel. Jeanne Zaino is with us today, Bloomberg politics contributor, of course, Democratic strategist, joined by Lester Munson, Republican strategist, principal at BGR Group. Great to see you both. Lester, how do you read this? Unless you're going to tell me that we're data dependent, and I understand that you do need a couple of months to realize a trend, but the fact is donors have been warming up to Donald Trump, not the opposite, during his criminal trial.
Well, I think it's two things. One, it appears Trump has a little bit of a lead in the polls, 1 or 2 points if you average it out. That helps excite his donor base. Also, the fact that he's appears to be being persecuted, if you will, certainly by his supporters, he's perceived as being persecuted. And so they want to come to his aid. And I think he's really worked this trial in New York to his advantage, whether it's a press conference outside the courtroom or railing at the judge or, the perfidy of Michael Cohen or whatever the little mini drama is. He's turned it into a real opportunity for fundraising here. So I guess we give him some credit for creativity.
Okay, well, but there also is the consideration that funding mechanism, at least the ability to stand outside the courthouse and plead your case each and every day, is about to potentially go away. The case is wrapped. The defense and prosecution rested their cases. We just wait until closing arguments next week and then jury deliberation. And Jeanne, this may be the only trial that actually happens. All of the other ones are on hold right now, basically indefinitely. So by getting rid of a legal headache, potentially, does it open up a new fundraising headache when you lose the opportunity to potentially have the visuals to pull in more dollars?
Yeah, I mean, I can't believe we're at a point where we're talking about, gosh, isn't a presidential candidate going to miss being under indictment for 34 felony counts when that trial ends? But you're right, that's where we are. These numbers are important. I was going to be one of those people that said, oh, Joe, but Democrats have more cash on hand, which is true. But I won't go there. But what I will say is that there is also a regular expectation that this happens, putting aside the trial and everything else, because, of course, Donald Trump has just recently gotten to the nomination. And, of course, when you get to the nomination, it opens up the ability to collect money with the RNC so he can collect these big checks. So there's other aspects of this. If it becomes a pattern, then that's going to be a problem for the Biden team. But right now, they feel pretty good about fundraising. Less so about what Lester mentioned, which is the polls. So that is a problem, but fundraising they feel okay about right now.
All right, well, Jeanne, let's say it out loud here. Joe Biden's campaign ended April with $84.5 million on hand. 84. Donald Trump's campaign had $48 million net cash on hand. But we've also talked here, Jeanne, a lot recently about whether money matters or to the extent to which money will matter in this general election campaign when the king of earned media is running against Joe Biden. How do you square these two?
Yeah, I mean, these are two people with 100% name recognition. Donald Trump is the king of earned media. So he's been able to win campaigns having less money. Just look back at 2016. That said, there's a different component here because, of course, he not only has less money on hand, but he's burning through cash because of his legal challenges. And that is a problem. They also are lagging behind on their ground game. He can, with earned media, make that up, particularly because we're talking about, 6 to 7 states. But it is a problem. So I'm one of those people. Money is not determinative in these things with this kind of name recognition, but it is an asset. So you'd rather have more of it than less.
Okay, so you'd rather have more than less. It also just isn't about having it in your possession, Lester, but using it effectively. Have we seen either of these campaigns use it effectively so far in the cycle, or are they all just hoarding it for the final push later?
Yeah, Kailey, a great question. I think the real campaign pros look at the burn rate, right? What does it cost you to raise the money? And then are you using it effectively with respect to the polls? Let's give both of these candidates credit. They won the nominations of their parties. It was a little bit harder, arguably, for Trump than Biden. Biden kind of stacked the deck as the incumbent. But here they are, and they were both the nominees last time, so they must be doing something right. I think the question is going to be, does Trump need more money this go round than he did 4 years ago or 8 years ago in order to deliver his message of putting the onus on Biden? He failed to do that last time. He was the election was about Trump in 2020. If he can make the election about Biden this year, then he's probably going to prevail. What does Biden need to make the election about Trump? Probably needs a little bit more than he's raising right now, so he's going to have to step up his game. But I think that's this question of the burn rate. Are you using the money effectively is exactly the right question.
We saw the Biden campaign make a big investment this month, Jeanne, a $15 million ad buy. Not just an ad buy, it's a $15 million spend that will also partially go to organizing on the ground, hiring up in different swing states. Could we be in a world where next month, the next time that we're looking at fundraising, or a couple of months down the road, we start seeing the fruits of that spending?
Yeah, I mean, they hope that they do, because this is going to be so focused on these key states. They understand the importance of organizing, and because it's going to be so tight in each of these states, I think the Biden team does have a more difficult path for that reason, and also as the incumbent. So it is a good campaign. It has been run well so far, but they come with their deficits. And we see the president with the recent announcement about the debate trying to change the trajectory, because it has been the polls so far that have left them in the position of feeling like they're a bit of the underdog at this point. But I agree with Lester. If Biden can make this about Trump, he's got a better shot. But if Trump can make this about Biden, then Trump has a better shot. The one good thing for Biden is Trump likes to make everything about himself. So, what's the likelihood he wants the focus to be on Joe Biden?
Well, he may not like the focus that is on his Truth Social account today for at least one reason. And that is after a video was posted on his Truth Social platform, on his account, that essentially showed a bunch of newspaper clippings talking about what would happen in a hypothetical Trump victory in 2024. And under the headline, "What's Next for America?" it referred to the creation of a unified Reich. This video was up for about 24 hours ultimately before it was taken down. Lester, the campaign said that it was posted by a staff member while Donald Trump was in court. But does it matter who posted it if it lived out there in the world for a full day?
No, it doesn't, Kailey. And it's shameful. That stuff shouldn't happen. And I'm under the impression that Susie Wiles and Chris Lasavita, who appear to be very good campaign managers, should have better control over the message than to allow something like that to happen. That's atrocious.
Does the Biden campaign call these out one by one as they happen, Jeanne, or do you just continue to give the other campaign rope on this?
You call them out. I mean, this is a despicable pattern. I couldn't agree more with Lester on this. It shouldn't have happened, but it's not the first and only time. This goes back to Charlottesville. This goes back to the 2016 campaign. This goes back to comments that he made to General Kelly. I mean, the list of anti-Semitic tropes by Trump are long. And I hope that Republicans who have been railing against young people for protesting the war, accusing them of being anti-Semitic, are equally as offended by this video that Trump's campaign put up, whether he was responsible for that or not.
All right, Jeanne, Zaino, and Lester Munson, our wonderful political panel today. Thank you so much for joining us. Jeanne, of course, is a Bloomberg Politics contributor. She's also Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency in Congress. And Lester Munson is the Republican strategist, as I said, but BGR Group co-head of the International Practice. And certainly that video, which stayed up for a considerable period of time, as I mentioned, Joe, getting a lot of attention today.
Yeah, to think we were reading about this morning and it was still there says a lot about the operation.
Yeah, absolutely. Although we have had reported consistently by us here at Bloomberg and others that the campaign, by and large, is more organized this time around and more disciplined with the messaging, which raises the question of how something like this would have
there's a bit of a distraction in Lower Manhattan. I realized they were in court yesterday. It's not there any longer, but the conversation will continue.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
From Washington, I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz. And it's pretty remarkable, Kailey. Here we are again talking about the potential for some votes in the Capitol, yet no one seems to think these bills are going to become law.
Yeah, one of them, a border bill that's going to get a vote for the Senate, very likely will not get adequate votes to even send it to the House. Then some crypto-related bills that are very likely to pass in the House that may not go anywhere in the Senate, where there is much more skepticism about the industry overall. We got the chance to speak with Congressman Tom Emmer, who's on the House Financial Services Committee, also serves, of course, as the House Majority Whip, who told us yesterday he does think the two crypto pieces of legislation will pass on the House floor. But we also got to talk with him about something else, because just minutes before our conversation, we got the news from the chair of the FDIC, Martin Gruenberg, that he would indeed step down once a successor was named. And this was Congressman Emmer's reaction.
He should have resigned weeks ago, perhaps years ago, based on the hundreds of pages of report that showed this toxic work environment with sexual harassment and all kinds of awful things with the employees. And yet here he goes again. Hey, I'm going to resign. I'm prepared to do that, but not until we have a successor. Well, guess what? Kailey, we've got 6 months left, roughly 6 or 7 months left. Marty Gruenberg needs to go yesterday, so he should resign and get out of there.
Congressman Tom Emmer, the House Majority Whip.
How do you really feel?
Last night, not holding back. Joining us now for more on this conversation, I'm pleased to say, is Bharat Ramamurti. He is formerly Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, now Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project. And he is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Bharat, great to have you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio. Mr. Gruenberg, much to the chagrin of, say, Congressman Emmer, has said he will step down once a successor is not just named, but confirmed. Would you take that job?
Well, I appreciate the offer, but no.
Have you gotten an offer?
No,
Have you had any discussion?
I haven't, and there's a lot of good candidates for that job, and I assume that the White House will pick one of them. But it's not something I'm interested in at the moment. I do think it's really important to take a step back. Number one, it's pretty commonplace for an outgoing chair to say that they will leave if and when somebody is confirmed for that role, so that there's a smooth transition there. And when Congress wants to act quickly, they can act very quickly and confirm one of a qualified nominee. So it should not take that long if Senate Republicans cooperate. Number two, I think it's important to remember that the FDIC is an extraordinarily important agency in all of this. I remember when I was in the White House last February during the Silicon Valley Bank situation, the FDIC was critical in making sure that issue didn't spiral out into a much larger problem with the banking system, and played a big role in containing that. So it's important that we get somebody into that role who's experienced and who has a strong hand on the till when it comes to financial regulation.
Yeah, you wonder who would want this job. If you read that report, the current state of the culture, the workplace culture alone in this agency is deeply troubled. This is going to require a fixer. Do you have a sense of what it would take to repair the problems at the FDIC?
Yeah, look, I think it is going to take some time when you have that type of issue at an agency which employs hundreds and hundreds of people, and where there's clearly some systemic issues. It's going to take somebody who comes in and makes it a real focus of theirs to turn those issues around. It involves sitting down with the employees, really listening to what the concerns are, putting in measures that would address those concerns. But it can be fixed, and I've seen it happen with other agencies that have had these types of systemic problems that have really improved over the years.
Well, certainly that effort, I'm sure, even now is underway, even if Marty Gruenberg says he's outgoing. There also is the consideration, though, as to what might not happen if he does indeed step down, or if we can't get someone else confirmed in time, which includes Basel III, capital reform for some of the biggest banks that are out there. Obviously, that is something this administration has been pushing very heavily across all of these different regulatory bodies when it comes to the prudential regulators, at least. Is that realistically going to happen now that all of this is happening, or is it time to call time on the end game of Basel III?
Well, look, I think that there's a number of complicating factors on Basel III. I think at the end of the day, there's a very strong case for higher capital standards on big financial institutions, but it takes a lot of coordination across agencies, and these types of issues, along with what's clearly been a big pushback from the industry and from some folks on the Hill, is going to complicate that timeline. Generally speaking, not a lot gets done in Washington a few months before a presidential election, so it wouldn't surprise me if the resolution of the Basel III issue happens after November. But this is another complicating factor in all of that.
We started by talking about the potential for a vote here on a crypto framework bill. Is this something that needs to happen? Because it's going nowhere, it seems, in the Senate.
I'd say on crypto, there's a pretty strong case for legislation that does a couple of things. Number one, really protecting consumers from the kinds of frauds and scams that are quite frequent in this industry based on what we have seen. And number two, making sure that whatever the use of these assets, they're not going to spill out into a broader risk to the financial system more broadly.
Are we giving enough money to the CFTC to do this right?
Well, my concern with this bill is that it falls short on both of those measures.
Really?
And that a good bill, I think, would be a step forward in terms of protecting consumers, in terms of addressing any systemic risk that crypto poses. My concern is that this bill isn't that bill, and that it would be good for Congress to go back to the drawing board and take another crack at this. Again, I'm in favor of doing that for the right piece of legislation. I'm just concerned that this isn't the right approach, and I think that those concerns are reflected in the Senate.
Well, what the industry will say is the concerning approach should be the approach taken by the regulator, specifically the chair of the SEC, Gary Gensler, who is instead, because there is no existing regulation written by Congress, is trying to apply securities law and basically just sue the way to authority. Can that status quo stay the same?
No, again, I think that there's a strong case for having some kind of legislated outcome here. When you have these types of new technological developments, it makes sense for Congress to step in and fill in some gaps that may exist in the current regulatory framework. They need to be very thoughtful about that. Look, my head goes back to pre-2008, where the financial industry came in repeatedly from 2000 onwards and said, these rules are too onerous. We need to make it easier to do subprime lending because it's easy. We've got to get access to credit for folks. And Congress listened to those industry requests. And what happened was that we set the conditions for a financial crisis that put the entire economy into a recession. We just need to be very, very careful when it comes to these types of changes to our financial system, because the risks of getting it wrong are so large.
We're spending time with Bharat Ramamurti, who is working as well with the Groundwork Collaborative in addressing the tax code. I want to ask you about the 2017 tax cuts, which we're hearing a lot about now, an effort to be made permanent here. You're on the other side of this argument. How do you tell Americans that they're better off with higher taxes?
Well, I think it's actually quite popular with Americans to make sure that the rich and big corporations are paying more in taxes. And what the Trump tax cuts did in 2017, if you recall, number one, there was a massive and permanent cut to the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And then there was a series of individual changes, like, for example, increasing the estate tax threshold, so fewer people pay that. Reducing the top tax rate for people making well over $400,000 in income each year. Those are set to expire in 2025. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, did a report that the cost of extending all of those expiring tax cuts is $4.6 trillion. And the majority of those benefits go to higher income households.
People have an association, though, with those tax cuts and a strong economy. That's a very difficult association.
So I would respectfully disagree on that. Do you know that the single most unpopular moment of the Donald Trump presidency wasn't when he was trying to go after health care? It wasn't when he was saying crazy statements about COVID. It was the week before he tried to pass the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And that's because the public really revolted against the idea that we should be spending trillions of dollars on tax cuts that primarily go to big corporations and the wealthy. And so
are you citing a poll or what?
Yeah, there's a survey research, go look at it, Gallup and so on. He was in the low 30s when it came to his approval rating at that point in time. And so, and that's one of the reasons why every single Democrat in Congress, from the most liberal to the most conservative, voted happily against that piece of legislation. And so now we have a chance in 2025. That's what this letter is about. To take a fresh look at all of this, because a lot of those provisions are expiring in the Trump tax bill. And so rather than thinking about which ones are we going to extend, which ones do we want to modify, we should be looking at the tax code holistically and say, we need to reverse this decades-long trend that we have towards bringing in less and less revenue. Just one final data point in all of this. Before the Bush tax cuts in the 2000s, we were bringing in, the federal government, about 20% of GDP and tax revenue each year. After the Bush tax cut and the Trump tax cut, it's closer to 16%. And that reduction in revenue by itself explains why our national debt is growing. And by the way, a lot of those benefits went to the very highest income households. So we need to reverse this trend, and 2025 is our opportunity to do that.
Well, this is going to be a big fight. We'd like to stay in touch with you on that.
Of course.
Bharat Ramamurti with us in his post-White House life, now senior advisor for economic strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project. Bharat, thank you for your insights today. Kailey, we're talking as well about an important day in Lower Manhattan as the defense rests in the Trump trial. And we want to go to New York, where June Grasso at Bloomberg Law is standing by with her take on what we learned here today. Not a huge change as the defense wrapped its case here, June. Not a huge change with what we had seen yesterday with Robert Costello, for instance. But tell us the significance of this moment now that we've seen both sides have their say.
Well, I think the prosecution actually made some good points and did an aggressive cross of Costello. So I don't know how the jury's viewing it, but I think one thing that you have to remember is he's the last witness. The defense put on 2 witnesses, and he was really the only witness of substance. And the jury's going to go home for how many days now until Tuesday with that on their mind. So I think the defense sort of went out with a whimper. But remember, the defense only needs 1 juror in order to hang up the jury. And that's probably what they're thinking. And their whole approach has really been to attack the credibility of the state's star witness, Michael Cohen. The prosecution, on the other hand, has been trying to pump up his testimony and use documents and texts and other witnesses' testimony to back him up. Today's jury instructions, the fight about jury instructions, and those are really the most important part of a trial, even though they're not the most interesting for for people who are there, but they're critical. And especially in this case where there's such a conundrum about what are the federal or state tax crimes associated here to make this a felony. So that's really important.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, June, because things aren't all done and dusted at court today. At 2:15 is when this meeting on jury instruction between the judge and the attorneys is set to happen. Just what exactly is involved in jury instructions? What will we be looking for?
So jury instructions, so the jury through the witnesses saw the evidence, but how do they apply the evidence? What's the law that they'll apply the evidence with? And that's something that the judge is going to give them in the instructions. It's not going to come from, what they saw at trial. It's going to come from the judge. So it's very important. And what's happening at the charge is each side is going to try to influence the judge in what the instructions are. There are standard instructions. The judge might just use standard instructions in some of these cases. He might use something that the defense proposes, something that the prosecution proposes, or a combination of each. But it's really critical. And, in appellate procedure, when there's an appeal, a lot of times it's reversed based on the jury instructions that were given. It's always a way for, the defense to attack a verdict. It's the judge gave the wrong jury instructions. So in this case, the jury instruction on what the election crime is connected to the falsifying the business records to make this a felony is going to be critical. And everybody knows that. The judge knows that. And so I'm sure he's going to be very careful, and it's going to be interesting to see what he says, what he decides.
Interesting entourage in court today. We've seen, a who's who of Capitol Hill. We had more members of Congress there. Eric Schmidt showed up. Ronnie Jackson was there today.
Yep.
Kailey, the former White House doctor, now a member of Congress. Dan Muser, Dale Strong, a few other. But Joe Piscopo also made his way to the courthouse today, June. And I'm just wondering, will that have any impact on the jury to see Joe Piscopo at court.
You know, I don't think the jury is really influenced by who's coming into the court. Unless Melania Trump came to the courtroom, I think that would be an impact, considering what the case is about and her connection to it. That would be an impact, but I don't think they're influenced by any of these people that come into the courtroom and sit there. I know that the reporters who are covering the trial are perturbed that these people are coming in and getting seats when, you know, a lot of times are waiting on line for hours. They get there at 5 a.m. or whatever to get seats because there are only a certain number allocated. Even the overflow room is overflowing. So I know that the reporters are not happy about it. I doubt the jurors pay any attention.
Wow. All right, June Grasso, Bloomberg Law, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. A fascinating day in court once again, Kailey. We'll wait for the instructions next.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
One of the other big stories that we're covering today here on Balance of Power is a new wrinkle on the U.S. policy in Israel and the very real challenges domestically, politically, that Joe Biden is facing here. As the president now calls outrageous this story that we discussed a bit yesterday, the International Criminal Court working up arrest warrants for the leaders of Hamas and Israel, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, at once. Outrageous, says Joe Biden. And that has become the conventional wisdom. We heard from Secretary of State Antony Blinken earlier. He called the decision to seek these arrests, quote, extremely wrong-headed, echoing the president. We heard earlier today on Bloomberg TV and radio, from Ron Dermer as we continue this messaging, clearly speaking in this case for the Israeli government, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs. He's part of the War Cabinet. His reaction to this news. Let's hear what he said on Bloomberg.
I agree with President Biden that it was outrageous. I'd also say that it was dangerous. Why is it outrageous? Because they're creating a false symmetry between Israel and Hamas, and they're basing it on false charges.
Challenging the conventional wisdom today in Washington is a voice that you've heard before on this program, writing for Bloomberg Opinion, Andreas Kluth, with a smart column and one that we should consider. Andreas is with me here, as you can see on YouTube at the table, writing, if the U.S. now scorns the court it helped to create in the 1990s, it will undermine the international regime of law and order that it claims to defend. It's great to see you, Andreas. Thank you for joining
Thanks
here.
For having me.
Walk me through your rationale here, because this is an administration that is specifically focused on equivalency. That's what Joe Biden said, that maybe if this had come in a different consideration, it would be a different story. But you're putting Israel and Hamas on the same stage here.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. So you heard in the soundbite just now, he used the word symmetry, and you just used the word equivalence. You heard that from Jim Risch in the Senate. You heard that from Biden, from Blinken. And it's interesting. It is absolutely true, in my opinion, that the two sets of applications for an arrest warrant, 3 Hamas, 2 Israeli, are not equivalent, morally or legally. The interesting thing is that this has become such a talking point in the news cycle because it's a red herring. The prosecutor, Karim Khan, in no way implied an equivalence. He did make a decision, and that may have been a mistake, in communicating this news to bundle the 5 cases into one announcement.
Yes, right.
And that gives an opening to people who will politically defend, and this is understandable, that they want to, that the U.S. wants to back Israel, which will counter this, and and of course Hamas was equally offended and rejected it as well. Yeah, right. So yes, just for equivalence.
Yeah.
But that gives them one opening, and the U.S. is now rejecting this on the basis of, if you listen to the press conference yesterday, a number of confused. So sometimes with this argument, sometimes one. Another one is, does the court even have jurisdiction? Now, it's not equivalent, and everyone needs to remember that this is an application for an arrest warrant, which was recommended unanimously by a panel of legal experts chosen from around the world after an enormous body of evidence, and it now goes to a panel of independent judges to even become a warrant. And then it will not go to trial for reasons we can revisit. Yeah. But if it did ever come to trial, each of the 5 would have a separate case, presumed innocence and all of that. And I'm saying the U.S. has a much larger strategic interest with a view to being called hypocritical in the global South, with a view to what it stands for, what it has stood for since World War II, in being on the side of international law. So whether it's domestic courts, so we just had in another context, a domestic law and order, or international, you cannot pick and choose. You cannot be for the rule of law and courts and independence of the judiciary only when it suits you.
So we should have front-loaded this conversation, and you just alluded to it by the fact that likely no one's going to be arrested because of these warrants. With that said, though, it sounds like you're isolating a communications problem here more than a procedural or legal one.
I think it is a communications problem, and he was trying, Karim Khan, the prosecutor, was trying to, he said explicitly, we have to choose, and this is the same for the International Court of Justice, a different court in The Hague, and in general for the organs and bodies of international law. And we have to decide, are we going to apply the law equally or not? By the way, a while back, I wrote a column. The United States is usually not in favor of applying the law equally, which would imply even to itself.
Nobody complained when they went to arrest Vladimir Putin, though.
Well, for instance, let's go to that. Yeah. That is very similar. If you take the point of jurisdiction, neither Ukraine nor Russia is a signatory to the Rome Statute, which established the court.
Therefore,
that didn't bother the United States because here it's in its interest to support the same court in going after Putin and building the evidence. Yes. It's a good storyline. But when the U.S. is afraid that the court might investigate an American, or in this case Israel, the Trump administration slapped sanctions on a judge and a lawyer of the ICC. And there's even a law passed by Congress called, facetiously, the Hague Invasion Act. If we ever bring an American to the court in The Hague, we'll invade and get them out. So you cannot, and you mentioned, I think, in the intro, that even the U.S., in this case, the Rome Statute, as in so many cases of other treaties, was actually the leader in getting it done. It wanted this. And then decided and got cold feet and says, oh, no, they might turn it against us. Well, we only want it when it suits us or when it's against other people and not against us. And I'm saying that is a bad look. And so there is more at stake. And actually, I firmly happen to believe, I said at the outset that even I believe they're not equivalent. Yes, I think Netanyahu and his defense minister, if it ever were to go to trial, which it won't, would be found innocent.
How about that?
But why not trust the court to find that?
Yeah. This is all about optics, and a great piece that I'll point you to from Andreas Kluth on the terminal, OPIN Go, or of course online, Bloomberg Opinion. Andreas, great to see you. Great
Thank you, Joe.
Writing and a great case to make here. Don't be a stranger. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.